And here it is, ladies and gentlemen, the single largest gathering of corporate executive CEOs in the history of Ghana. It is the second Ghana CEO Summit. Put your hands together. And ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome one another. All right. A very good afternoon to you, our distinguished CEOs, our friends from the media, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second plenary of this august second edition of the Ghana CEO Summit. I am, by the grace of God, Jerry Ajololo, and I'm thrilled to be your master of ceremonies for today. Just gone by in the morning was the powerful opening ceremony, which saw, as our guest of honor, Ghana's senior minister representing His Excellency, the President of the Republic. It was a very refreshing time, and we dwelt on the theme, Digital Innovation Economy for Business Growth. It was capped with a very powerful executive interview, which was hosted by the Dean of the Gimpa Law School, Mr. Kofi Amoah, and we also had the chance to interact with our guest of honor, the senior minister, who threw light on a lot of things dwelling on our theme. For the next few inspirational hours, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have 3 amazing panel discussions, and we're going to have 4 very insightful presentations also bordering around this theme. Once again, a few house rules. I would urge that we place all our phones on silent to avoid any interferences. If you want to catch up with work, that's outstanding. You may please tap into our free Wi-Fi made possible by Tigo. And you can interact with us on social media using the hashtag Ghana CEO Summit. On Facebook, you can reach us on Ghana CEO Summit. On Instagram, we are GH CEO Summit. And on Twitter, we are at Ghana CEO Summit. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, setting the tone for the second plenary, I would like to acknowledge with gratitude the contribution of our sponsors by whose generosity we've been able to come this far. Please acknowledge Fidelity Bank, Prudential Life Insurance, Tigo Business, The Exchange, the Margins Group, AFND International, Universal Container Services and Structures, IBM, Group Ideal, and Kung Fu as our platinum sponsors. For our gold sponsors, we are honored to have Vanguard Assurance, Puma Energy, ANC Development, Atlas Rent-A-Car. Let's hear it up for our gold sponsors too. In the silver category, we're blessed to have Omni Bank, Enterprise Life, SGSSB, Akasa Power Generation, West Blue Consult, Nielsen, Surfline MultiChoice, Nalem, Delta Airlines. Ladies and gentlemen, they are our silver sponsors. A round of applause. And for bronze, MTN, First Bank, Vodafone, Herbalife, Apollonia, Zenith Bank, Deftraco Plus, Goyle, Busy, Managing Ghana, UT Life, Stallion Group, Accretive Ghana, Shell Ghana, Specialized Top Core Security, Barclays Ghana, Global Access, Engine, Melcom, Amaris Terminal, and Ines Fly. But ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for them too. And in the last 2 categories, we have our media partners, Star FM, DDP, iStream Live, Ghana Web, Daily Graphic, GBC, Joy FM, Multimedia, My Joy Online, Joy FM, Impact Hub. Let's hear it up for them too. And last but certainly not the least, our partners, Deloitte, Kempinski, Ivert, Oxford Business Group, and together let's do one resounding round of applause for all of them. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And so, for the next few minutes, precisely 20 minutes, we're going to have a learning partner address. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a case study of robotics in business. To do this for us, we have the pleasure of having in our midst from the SA office of Deloitte, South Africa. Please welcome Mr. Valter Adao.
So, good afternoon. Senior Minister, Ministers of State, distinguished CEOs, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, thank you very much for the privilege to speak at such an illustrious event. I've thoroughly enjoyed the morning conversations, and it's massively encouraging the kind of dialogue that we're having. And then to my partners at Deloitte for making it possible for me to speak today. So I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes with you speaking about robotics. But it's an important, to me it was quite important that we don't spend all the time going into the details and the technicality of robotics. I wanted to unpack the philosophy behind why concepts like robotics is becoming very important. And as business leaders, CEOs, irrespective of the business that you're in, we need to pay attention to what's happening at the moment. I just do want to say up front that the clicker is struggling a little bit with the distance. So if I do point out my arm, I'm desperately trying to change the slides. Look, it's working. So to get us going, I want to start on the concept of the fourth industrial revolution. It is something that we are reading about quite extensively at the moment. It was first used at Davos 2 years ago, and at the last Davos, it was certainly the center of most conversations. And I recently spoke at the World Economic Forum, and once again, this was the main focus of the discussions, is how to, what are we as businesses, how do we leverage what's happening in the fourth industrial revolution? I think critically is that we need to recognize that we are in this fourth industrial revolution. It's referred to as the digital era. And I suppose the benefit of being in the fourth industrial revolution is that we can learn from the previous three, and we can take those lessons from it and not make the same mistakes. So the first industrial revolution was the introduction of energy into the workplace. The second was automation, and the third was the introduction of enterprise computing into industry. And what we can take from each of these revolutions is that organizations that failed to change with what was happening around them disappeared overnight. And those organizations that became curious about these new changes and brought them into their business and embedded them into their products and services became the new giants of our business world. And just think of brands like Microsoft and IBM, etc., that took advantage of these revolutions. Now, the significance of these revolutions can be described in this graph. Now, it's very difficult to see because the screen is pixelated, but this is a study we conducted titled Short Fuse Big Bang. Now, the fuse speaks for itself. It's the time horizon, it's the x-axis, and the bang relates to the disruption an industry is going to face as a result of these new disruptive technologies. So if you're in the top left-hand quadrant, that is the short fuse big bang quadrant. That's not a good place to be in at the moment. Yet I suspect 60 to 70% of the CEOs represented in this room are in that quadrant right now. Now, this study was done 18 months ago, approximately. It was hypothesis-based. It's got one flaw, and I'll explain to you what that flaw is. But if I take you through it, with the hindsight of 18 months having passed, the industry at the top left-hand part of the short fuse big bang quadrant is retail trade. And looking back on the last 18 months, I think we can tick the box that is an industry under a tremendous amount of strain worldwide. 2 years ago, on Black Friday, more stuff was sold online for the first time ever than in physical stores. Last year, as many items were sold off mobile phones as it was sold online, and a lot more than in physical stores. And recently, we've seen interesting articles published, like the Retail Armageddon, as a result of this disruption that's taking place in this industry. So big brands, big retail brands that we study at business schools are now slowing down their physical expansion of bricks and mortar. An example, Walmart, well studied, broadly studied, has announced that they will slow down the expansion of their stores in North America. And their comment was, every time we open a store, Amazon adds another server. And that is the reality that the retail businesses are facing. Companies like Macy's shutting down 22 stores and are on the verge of being bought, not for the retail trade, but for the property that they're in. So I think we can certainly tick that the short fuse big bang is playing out in that industry. The next one on the top, if you move towards the right at the top, is technology, media, and telecoms. Now, I don't have to go into detail around media and the disruption it's certainly facing in this digital era that we're in, but technology companies and telco companies are also facing certain challenges. And it's widely written about at the moment. But I want to draw your attention to the next one down from that. It's the financial services industry, and the one below that is the professional services industry. So organizations like Deloitte are also facing tremendous disruption. And you open any newspaper, any economics journal, and they're going to be writing about fintech, robotics, the Internet of Things, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, etc. It is upon us. So from this study, it certainly tells us or tells me at least, that we've got to be paying attention to these disruptive technologies that are going to influence the way in which we develop product and service and how we engage with our customers. Now, I want to point out the flaw of the study. The study was based on disruption taking place from inside the industry. In other words, your competitor disrupting you or disrupting the sector. What it failed to take into account is that as industries in the top left-hand quadrant face additional pressure, they're going to go look for relevance in industries that have got a longer fuse. And we're seeing that happening already. We're seeing telcos moving into healthcare, technology companies moving into education and healthcare in order to find that additional relevance in terms of the products that they provide to the market. Now, if we unpack this a little bit further, the disruptions started off with the list on the left-hand side, things like analytics, cloud, social media. That was the start of this digital disruption. But it's massively moved across to these exponential disruptions. Things like blockchain, cryptocurrencies, wearables, robotics, Internet of Things. It certainly feels like we're living in a science fiction movie. And if you imagine it, you can make it happen. The reality is that this isn't science fiction anymore. And it's certainly not on a horizon far enough for us to sit back and think about how we are going to introduce these technologies into our business. I'm seeing it all over the continent, all over the Middle East and in Europe. These businesses are becoming core to the strategic fabric of organizations as they not only fight to be competitive, but to remain relevant in their specific sectors. So if we unpack it down to the world of robotics, which is the topic of conversation, this is just one of those exponential technologies that are changing the way in which we are going to provide service and product and ultimately drive cost optimization inside our business. Now, maybe as a show of hands, who knows what robotics is in the workplace? All right. So it's quite interesting. I was meeting the other day with the board of a very well-known company, and one of the members said that they certainly need to move into robotics, but they need to implement a change management process because it will probably create a lot of discomfort to have a physical robot sitting at the office. And it's not that. So robotics in the workplace is not about having a physical robotic android sitting at the office replacing human beings. It is a virtual thing. It's a virtual piece of software that exists on top of the organization's IT capabilities. It doesn't really touch the architecture of the organization. It doesn't really add much more burden. It mimics a human on top of your existing software. So there's different phases of robotics or different generations of robotics. Quite prevalent at the moment is the one at the top, which is pure interactive robotics. It is robotics that mimics human beings that do repetitive, low value-adding processes in the workplace that are massively expensive but necessary. So it's the filling of databases, uplifting data off application forms, loading information into enterprise systems so that they become part of the membership base, processing in claims, be it healthcare, be it insurance, be it whatever, something along those lines. That's where we're seeing 80% of robotics being used across the world and on the continent right now. The second phase of robotics, or the second generation of robotics, starts involving judgment. And this is where robotics start absorbing the information that's coming into them that they are curating or accumulating, and then based on that, they can make decisions. And at that point, this is where we're linking up robotics to things like blockchain, to the Internet of Things, etc. So let me give you a practical example. If you have a mining operation or a big factory that is connected through Internet of Things, IoT, and there's a power failure which kicks off the diesel generator, the IoT device would send a message, or traditionally, as soon as the generator kicks in, the foreman would make a note to make sure that there's diesel delivered. An order is placed for diesel, the necessary procurement process are put in place, so that as the generator burns up diesel, there's a new supply coming. In the world of robotics with judgment, as soon as there's a power failure and the diesel generator kicks in, the robotic process would receive a message from the IoT device saying there's an issue with power, the generator's running. The robotic device would place the necessary order automatically, open up the procurement systems, load the amount, the quantities, etc., trigger off a process, make sure that the process is complete, and then send a message back to the foreman to say, we received the order, we've placed the order, the diesel's on its way. That's the second generation of robotics. The final generation of robotics revolves reasoning. And this is, we're not there yet. We read a lot about it in the press, that it's robotics with artificial intelligence. And that's essentially where robotics start applying reason to decisions that they have to make. They don't necessarily follow the protocol. They take a variety of things into account, and then they learn from previous experiences so that they make the best possible decision. We're certainly not there yet. It's, you know, and I think the term AI or artificial intelligence is used broadly, but it's not in practice yet. Now, if we start bringing robotics into the human world, imagine this scale as being least complicated functions on the left-hand side to very complex cognitive functions on the right-hand side. Now, if we had to overlay the current robotics processes that are being used by organizations all over the world, we would be playing on the far left-hand side of the spectrum. So essentially, we are replacing repetitive, low-value processes inside organizations, which are critical, however, for the organizations, but don't add a tremendous amount of value to customer experience or to the revenue-generating line or the profit line of the organization. Yes.
I have a little more time, but
sure.
My delegates are telling me you're beginning to sound very robotic. If you could please take the mic a little up, you sound human for us. Thank you.
Is that a bit better? All right, okay. So we start from the first slide again. All right. So, I mean, if we overlay robotics in terms of human behavior, the left-hand side of the screen is essentially where robotics are playing at the moment. It is the repetitive, value-adding processes inside organizations, and we're very far away, as I said earlier, from the cognitive reasoning application of judgment in terms of what we'd expect to see at this point. Now, the immediate benefits one can unlock from the use of robotics, that early stage mimicking repetitive process from robotics, is easily described in this image. So firstly, there's an immediate improvement in quality and accuracy of the work that's been done. In other words, there are no human errors linked to data capturing, to being tired or disgruntled or unhappy at work. The environment is completely confidential because ultimately there's no human fingers touching the processes and looking at the information that sometimes can be quite sensitive. We see an 80% improvement in efficiencies, and that efficiency is driven out from the fact that, once again, no errors coming through the system, but the robotic environment can operate 24 hours a day. It's not necessary to stop or operate against normal working times, so one can keep on operating, and one can also scale up as necessary and introduce additional robotic processes. There's flexibility that we spoke about, and scalability, which means that an organization doesn't necessarily have to start with a large robotic farm or army. They can start with a small number of robotic processes, and as and when required during peak periods throughout a period of the company's life cycle, they can introduce additional processes or reduce those processes. And then finally, a very important thing, specifically in the world of healthcare, insurance, and financial services, is that every single robotic process is logged, and therefore proper accountability and tracking can take place. All these things come together to add a tremendous amount of value to an organization without necessarily adding additional costs. What I want to show in this next over the next 2 minutes is an actual robotic process taking place in the organization. So this is, I think it's an insurance company, and they're going to receive application forms. The robotic process is going to uplift the information of that application form, put it into a database, and then take it out the database once it's properly organized, put it into the enterprise system, which loads membership detail, and then they're going to close it off by sending an acknowledgement letter to the member to say your form is received and your application has been processed. Have a look. So what we saw there was a robotic process doing a person's job in 1 minute that would normally take 15 minutes. And as you watch the video clip, I mean, it was opening up different screens that we're familiar with, email, enterprise systems, etc. And you actually see the mouse running across the screen and populating the numbers and writing the various fields. That is the robotic process. So it gives you a great illustration of how it runs off the existing systems inside the organization without adding additional complexity. Now, when we speak about robotics, there's a number of concerns that come up, and perhaps let me try and dispel some of these concerns. The first one is that many organizations that we initially start dealing with think that in order for robotics or the RPA processes to unlock value for the organization, they need a very big army of robots. And that's certainly not the case. Any process inside the organization that is low value adding is expensive. So elimination of that process immediately starts adding value. And specifically in areas or industries where there's a lot of paper processing of application forms or claim forms, the processing cost of a paper form and the errors that go associated with it are quite significant. It varies from industry to industry, but you're looking at in the region of $40 to $50 to process a piece of paper, and that's on the lower end of processing costs. There's also generally a concern that robots will eliminate jobs, and I think that's a very important point to ponder. The reality is that certain jobs will certainly become irrelevant in the world of robotics. But research has shown us that as organizations adopt robotics, they don't necessarily eliminate heads, but they redeploy their workforce into value-adding or more efficient processes inside the organization. And an interesting or a critical thing to consider as well is that as your competitors in your specific industry start adopting robotics and become more efficient, it is difficult to compete at a very large scale in a traditional sense. So it's a case of we need to adapt these technologies. It links back to that fourth industrial revolution. But when it comes to jobs inside organizations, we need to see how we can best redeploy those resources or put them on more efficient functions inside the organization. Myth 3, that robots can think like humans. It's certainly not, as I explained earlier. They follow very basic processes that can be linked to an algorithm, but they can't apply judgment or they can't learn at this point. Not really an important item for the room, but organizations that do outsource services for other organizations, they're not going to be eliminated by robotic processes. In actual fact, I think this is going to enhance their service because they will introduce robotics into the environment. Finally, the reduction of IT, the importance of IT inside organizations. This is normally a concern because the RPA processes, the robotic processes, doesn't require an experienced IT person necessarily to implement and to configure the processes inside the organization. But certainly it doesn't reduce the dependence of IT. I think it speaks to broader partnership and collaboration with the IT departments. And then finally, the myth that if you implement robotics, that you're going to have an error-free environment. And that is also not correct. The accuracy and the capability of those robotics really comes down to how the algorithms are drawn up, number one. And number two, it also comes down to how efficient the processes are inside your organization. So I always recommend that before we invest in the implementation of robotics, that we look at driving some efficiencies in existing processes and then plugging on these algorithms on top of that. So as we wrap up, I want to share with you look, there's many case studies, but this one I thought was quite interesting because it's not necessarily a run-of-the-mill case study. But a project that some of our people have been involved in related to a UK-based bank with an insurance arm, and they found themselves in a situation where they were faced with having to process an extensively high number of PPI claims. And they had a certain time period within which to process those claims, after which they would start getting fined. Now, as they opened up their processes to start accepting PPI claims, they got flooded with a tremendous amount of volumes that their people couldn't cope with. The data to manage these claims sat on a variety of different systems. And immediately on the get-go, they realized they will not make the deadline if they process it against in the normal way using the people. So they introduced a robotic process into this environment. They identified 32 different processes that they could automate. They brought in 100 robots, which was the equivalent of 150 people. And during that time period, I think they processed 2.6 million claims and saved the organization £600,000 compared to the traditional process. The amount of rework required to process those claims had also dropped quite significantly due to the elimination of errors. And some interesting stats, as you can see up on the screen, they were processing 80,000 claims a week as a result of the implementation of the RPA. Ultimately, there was a very clear benefit that the organization could derive from the implementation of RPA without any impact on the headcount inside the organization. So with that, that's my 20 minutes. I'm a minute away from the completion of my 20-minute slot. I am going to be at the Deloitte lounge after this and throughout the breaks. And if you want to further discuss additional business cases or the dynamics of introducing this into your environment and things to think about, or even if you want to have a conversation around any of the other exponential technologies, please don't hesitate to reach out. It will be a lovely conversation to have with you. Thank you very much.
And ladies and gentlemen, he did this in exactly 29 minutes, 13 seconds. A round of applause for Mr. Valter Adao. If you're talking about robots, you must be precise. And so as we move towards the digital innovation economy, we ask ourselves, will robots inherit the earth? Well, the answer is simple. Yes, they will. But they will be our children, because strategy and implementation definitely lies with us. In talking about the insurance companies and the innovative ways of adapting robots and all that, ladies and gentlemen, there is one company amongst us who happen to be our platinum sponsors. Since 1848, they've delighted the world by providing innovative life assurance solutions. Today, Prudential Life Insurance would like to offer 25% discount to all companies that sign up for their corporate life insurance for their employees. Why bother and put that on your wage bill when Prudential Life can do that for you? So ladies and gentlemen, they will be around. You can visit their stand and acquaint yourself with their numerous products which are tailor-made for your organizations. Firms Advisory Limited is a business consulting firm providing services in business compliance, market research, and trade development. They have been appointed by the Ghana CEO Summit to collect feedback from exhibitors, sponsors, and CEOs. Tomorrow morning, they will be approaching you with their tablets for a quick feedback lasting not more than 5 minutes. Kindly give them your maximum cooperation. I guess we all do. And now, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, before we move to the next session, which is the panel discussion, may I acknowledge with gratitude once again our guest of honor who has devoted time to be with us for this panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for the Honorable Osafo Marfo. We thank you very much, sir. And so for the next few minutes, precisely 1 hour, 45 minutes, which will be a panel discussion on what is the growth path for Ghana's economy, following after the very insightful presentation by our guest of honor. It gives me great joy to welcome the following distinguished panel. Please welcome Mr. Henry Oroh, Madam Natalia A, Koliadina, Mr. Alhassan Andani, Dr. Kofi Amoah, Mr. Ibrahim Awal, and Mr. Mike Vincent. Please cheer them on as they take their seats. And we say a warm welcome to you. If you look into your folder right on the table, you would notice that we have some cheats for lunch. We have 2 venues, and they are all stated right on the cheats, so please do well to carry them along when we go for lunch. To moderate this session, ladies and gentlemen, he is a broadcast journalist and the head of talk and thought leadership at the Multimedia Group. I give to you Mr Adao.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and good afternoon to you all. I think I'm missing a few people on the panel. All right, the representative from Deloitte is not going to be able to make it, but I think the Minister for Business Development is in here somewhere. Okay, yes please, Mr. Awal, join us. And Mr. Kweku Kwating, Deputy Minister of Finance, you may also join us up here. Okay, and Mr. Martin Atafin will replace Mr. Vincent from Deloitte. So, gentlemen, please take your seats. Thank you all very much. I've been told that we're running a little late. We're approximately 65 or so minutes behind time, so we'll get cracking very quickly. Natalia is the representative for the IMF in Ghana. Dr. Kofi Amoah is obviously a man that needs no introduction, an entrepreneur and a passionate Ghanaian. And Mr. Atafin is a senior partner at Deloitte, and Mr. Kweku Kwating is an MP and also a Deputy Minister of Finance, and Mr. Henry Oroh is the Managing Director for Zenith Bank, and of course the Minister for Business Development, Mr. Awal, joins us. And thank you. Let's all welcome them with a round of applause. Now, Ghana is indeed one of the most blessed territories, and I say so because, one, our geography puts us in a fantastic place to be able to do business with the entire globe. Beyond that, our land is covered with every kind of resource that should make us a rich nation. 60 years on after our independence, you look back at those who were around about the same stage of development with us, and they have far gone ahead of us. The question is, if we have been on this journey for 60 years, what did we miss that all these other nations, particularly Singapore, Malaysia, later on India and Brazil, did right? And this panel is going to help us understand all of those. And so we're going to light a very big fuse, which hopefully will get us thinking differently and acting differently by the time we walk out of here. I would like to start with Dr. Kofi Amoah. In your opinion, what should we have done right?
Well, first let me say good afternoon to all of you. Thank you to the organizers, and to pay respect to Honorable Osafo Marfo. I worked with him before, a very committed and brilliant man. We're lucky to have him. What should we have done differently? Well, to me, development is about using resources and doing the things that are easy to do. As they say, the low-hanging fruits. Now, every nation starts development by focusing on their most abundant resources. In our case, as you rightly said, we are abundantly resourced with land and people. And the economics that I studied, if you put land and people together, you create wealth. Now, if you go back and look at the economic history of all these nations that have developed, the first wave of nations, the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, they focused on using their land and their people in the field of agriculture. The United States, cotton, the United Kingdom, wool. Germany came and studied them. Then this was during the 1800s. The next wave of countries that came after that, China, Japan, Korea. What did they do? They used the same method of focusing on their abundant resource of land and people in the field of agriculture and livestock. Then you come to the next wave of countries, what I call the classmates of Ghana: Malaysia, Taiwan, Singapore. What did they do? Here again, you look at Malaysia, they did the same thing in the field of agriculture by utilizing the immense spans of land and their people. And therefore, to me, it's like looking at the engine of a car. The physics of that is known. And in development, it is established that your low-hanging fruit is utilizing your abundant labor and your abundant land. And for us in Ghana, you can add a lot of other things. As Mr. Osafo was saying, good fertile soil, 5 degrees above the equator, rainfall. In the United States, you have shops that specialize in products that are made without fertilizer. This is a clear case of Ghana being able to take advantage of something like this. So for me, if we had focused on the cocoa project example, where this crop came in and nature being so kind to us, it fit perfectly in our environment. And with intelligent government policy, yes, Honorable Minister said, no government established a single farm, but there was an intelligent government policy to support the growth and expansion of the cocoa project for Ghana to become the #1 in the world. Cheap loans to the farmers, subsidy, extension offices, and these unsophisticated farmers could not go and negotiate to sell their cocoa beans in the United States or the UK. Cocoa Marketing Board. When they finished producing these cocoa beans, put it in a sack labeled Ghana Cocoa and take it. The CMB would then take it and negotiate for a good price. Here is a perfect example of private sector, public sector collaboration, utilizing the abundance of the land and the people that we have with the soil and the rainfall that was conducive for this experiment. And so I think we need to continue with that. Oil palm, if you take oil palm, a lot has been written about this. Malaysia makes billions of dollars on oil palm. The same example, we could have duplicated that in the cocoa project. China buys 12 million tons of oil palm a year. India, 6 million. Malaysia has made a lot of money growing this crop that they took from West Africa, just like Fernando Po gave us the cocoa through Tetekwashi. So the emphasis has to be, what are the natural resources that you have? And I think the President Akufo-Addo's government emphasis on the one district, one factory, to me symbolizes the beginnings of us being in touch with the right road to travel that all these other nations have traveled, who are now the big economies. Let's focus on the low-hanging fruits. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't do anything else. But I think for Ghana, if you look at the rural-urban drift, all these young people who are not lazy, looking for something to do, they wake up 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning standing by the roadside. If we were to focus and help them to get something to do in the hinterlands of Ghana, I think we'll have a strong domestic economy, create jobs for millions of people, and reduce the import dependency.
Thank you very much. I gather from your, thank you. I gather from your submission, Dr. Amoah, that for you, maybe more than two, but key would be that a focus on agriculture and industrialization probably should be something we must prioritize. I'd like Mr. Atafin to come in on this. This is not new knowledge.
No.
You've known this. If you would refer to the second document, the 7-year development plan under Kwame Nkrumah, all of these were documented in there. So what has been the challenge in implementing these ideas since 1960?
I think one of the main challenges we have is to move from strategy to execution, from intent to delivery. We need to be able to move from a situation where we talk about everything, but we have to do it. That is one of the challenges we have. One of the things that we have in abundance is the brains. I think in Ghana we are blessed with people who can think through things and have all the thought processes. But for someone to take it and make sure that it is delivered, for someone to be able to make sure that people are accountable for the things that we talk about, it's also a challenge. So accountability becomes a problem for us. We need to be accountable for whatever we do and whatever we say. Thank God now we have a ministry responsible for monitoring and evaluation, to monitor the things that we said we will do, to make sure that it is done, evaluate it, and make sure that it will be done and delivered properly. So we've known everything that we need to do for a very long time, but we don't go through the steps a little at a time to make sure that it has worked. Another challenge I think that we have had is in the area of education, where I think that we are missing the link between the education and industry. Because it may seem that we had a structure that trained people to be able to be well educated, but not to tie it to what is in the industry. So we have only few people who migrate into industry very easily, but there are others who have to struggle a little bit, and of course there's a lot of waste of precious time and energy before they can shift into the industry. For some of us who do employ, sometimes you find that, look, you need a longer lead time of training the people to be able to fit into what they have to do. And I shudder to think about those who are actually in the more technical areas of industry to find the right people to fit in those places. So if we are able to tie education to industry and know that by the time people are leaving school, they are actually able to deliver and make an impact, that would also be able to help us to progress.
Thank you very much. Let me bring in Mr. Awal, and after which I would like Natalia to also take this. Now, it seems we agree that we know what the problem is. Your specific portfolio is novel, in that it's meant to stimulate the business development cycle. Hearing what we've all heard so far, how much time will it take for us to be able to get this juggernaut on the road? And what will it take to do that?
Thank you. Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Honorable Senior Minister, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Government has identified the issues that we are discussing today. I think that one key problem that we had in the past was to nurture a private sector that should lead the growth agenda of this country. It's all been a public sector-driven thing. And another Akufo-Addo government has identified it. That is why the Ministry for Business Development has been set up. We are supposed to identify the problems to business. And according to World Bank Ease of Doing Business ranking, Ghana is 108 out of 190. This is not acceptable. I have been tasked with other sector ministers and agencies to reduce this Ease of Doing Business index to an acceptable limit by the close of this year. If Rwanda, Zambia, and Kenya can be in the 60s, 70s, 90s, why not Ghana? With all our resources. In line with this, government is also launching what we call the National Entrepreneurship Innovation Plan to make sure that young people in this country are trained and equipped with entrepreneurial skills. They see themselves not only as job creators, not those seeking jobs. We have 12 million workers in this country. 12 million people work. Out of that, less than 1 million are in the public sector. 11.2 million are in the private sector. What then do we do as a government? Government is therefore creating the space, giving scope private sector to develop. That is why there's going to be a very high-level private-public sector dialogue chaired by the President or Vice President that to meet regularly to discuss business issues. And I want to entreat private sector businesses, when this forum is established, constantly bring up the issues. In my office now, we have a table, a desk. We've had about 150 requests on specific businesses. So I think that our government has identified the key issues that the private sector should lead the development of the economy, and the government will create the space for the private sector to do that. But the government alone cannot do it. We need to create a workforce that do not go out from school and look for a job, but that themselves are job creators and job owners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Natalia Koliadina, you sit in Ghana as the IMF rep. And so I'm sure you've seen quite a lot of reports telling you how the countries that Mr. Awal mentioned, particularly Rwanda, who everyone seems to be celebrating lately, got it right. But I'd like to take you back into history, borrowing from the example of Southeast Asia. Now, after the Korean War, South Korea received well over 60 billion in grants and loans, and they turned their story around. Ghana's been to the IMF many times, and we're still where we are. What learnings are there? How different have they been able to utilize these, and where are we going wrong?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Honorable Senior Minister, Honorable Ministers, Honorable Deputy Minister. It is really a great honor to be here and speak to, to distinguished chief executives. So let me take a look back a little bit and also highlight some of the very important issues which were stressed by Honorable Senior Minister. First, he mentioned that Ghana needs to get the fundamentals, economic fundamentals right. And it is very important. And indeed, it is the path to graduate from IMF programs. He also said that it is very important to put the house, economic house, in order. And we see that this is something that the government has already been doing, and I will focus on it. And he gave a very important example that 107% of revenue, government revenue, is spent only on wages and salaries, interest payments, and statutory payments, nothing else. No capital spending, no social spending, no maintenance spending. And I think it is very important. Just to take you back a little bit, our recent study for Sub-Saharan Africa looked at 50 years of data on growth. And what we have noticed is that the spells of growth are actually longer now, and they're more significant. At the same time, the growth fluctuations remain very significant, higher than elsewhere in transition economies, emerging markets, frontier markets. Why is that? One of the reasons is the dependence on resources, natural resources. Yes, natural resources is a great wealth, but it should not become a curse. So, again, we looked at the region, and the region has not been doing so well. Last year, in 2006, average growth in Sub-Saharan Africa was less than 1.5%, which is very low. and primarily because of the resource-dependent countries, primarily because of a very significant dip in oil prices. Now, Ghana looks a bit better. Its growth last year was 3.5%, but it is nowhere close to what it used to be in 2010, 2012. We also looked at the external economic environment. And while it improved slightly in 2016, with the cost of borrowing slightly lower and somewhat improved resource prices, still, it wouldn't really support economic growth. So what's important? It is very important to look and implement domestic policies and domestic reforms. And this is what we're supporting the government with in our program. Just to explain in a few words what we're doing. Last year was a very significant setback in terms of fiscal consolidation. Budget deficit increased to 8.75% of GDP, and also it resulted in higher debt to GDP ratio, which is currently at 73% of GDP, and also a greater financing need for the government. What does it mean for the private sector? It means that the private sector has less financing, the cost of financing is high, and the uncertainty is still high because the outside world is looking whether the government would implement its ambitious policies this year. Indeed, we welcome the authorities' budget in 2017, which aims at reducing the fiscal deficit to 6.5%, and it would help significantly to stabilize the debt. It would help very importantly to rebuild confidence, but it is only the beginning of the road. The government has also started working on macro-structural reforms. For example, making fiscal transparency more credible. What I mean by that is including all the government agencies into the GIFMIS and also implementing the Treasury single account. It would help taking control over the purse, over the government purse, sorry. And also latest measures which are aimed at controlling the payroll of the government. These are all very important measures because it would help the government to open some space and to reduce these three very important items to less than 107% of revenue. And I'm talking about wages and salaries, transfers to statutory funds, and also debt service.
So essentially, we are spending money where we're not going to see the right amount of returns. And Mr. Kwating, your ministry has a job to do. Now, fiscal consolidation has been adopted, albeit belatedly, and I know that while you were in opposition, you kept on going on about fiscal consolidation as far back as 2013. So we eventually have arrived at the point where we've decided to do that. But that's not going to fix the problem in itself. There is the notion that our approach to managing the basically managing inflation or inflation targeting is creating problems for the banks so that our interest rates are so high and we're unable to put money into the private sector that's supposed to be the engine of growth. How can that change?
Well, thank you very much. But let me take us a little back. You asked the question, where did we go wrong? It's interesting that it's me that should say this, but I think we went wrong on political leadership. I mean, governance is about making those tough choices when you have limited resources and the courage to fight waste and corruption. I think on the point of leadership, as a country, we have not done very well. And going forward, it is important that we look critically at that and ensure that some of the leadership cultures that characterized governance in the past does not remain going forward. Otherwise, we'll keep moving and talking, but you don't get the political leadership right, you're going to have difficulties. But to answer the question you asked directly in broader terms, you see, Ghana violated, in my opinion, what ought to be a certain economic growth logic, that you have a lot of resources, you have land, you have these resources, and that should be an incentive for manufacturing and processing. And then once economic activity expands because you are trying to change your primary goods, the services should follow to serve economic activity. Now, for some reason, and I'm not in doubt that it's related to colonization, we produce a raw material and it has been for direct selling, commerce. And then somehow the services started taking off. And I've been asking, the services that the services sector produces, what do we use it for? We use it for commerce. And that's why today, if you don't have a job, and it has almost become culture, and they say, if you got a kiosk somewhere, you can sell. And then the question of what do we want to sell has become a difficulty. So when the nation is not creating wealth because we're exporting raw material, and government is not generating enough, and there is pressure, and in the absence of weak political leadership, then the idea is to spend. And then your macroeconomy destabilizes, businesses suffer, and then we move one, we come back, we move one, we come back. In addition to fixing what I think is an important element of our development, the political courage, I also think that we must go to the industrialization, the missing link. We must go back to it, and that is why this policy of one district, one factory is a policy that has to be taken very seriously. Without it, you're not creating the wealth. And even if we chose not to call it one district, one factory, the point is that if we don't look at wealth creation, which is industrialization, that is how I understand it, we're not going to get anywhere. And so once we can do that, and it's industry and enterprise that is expanding and providing resources for government. And then so long as we have the discipline to put our money where our mouth is, government, the economic environment will be stable. Then the CEOs of our private businesses can play their role and let the economy grow. These are my perspectives. Now more directly to your question. You asked what we're doing about this. As the senior minister indicated, if you took out statutory funds, that is earmark funds, money that have been spent by law. Let's say the law says you collect your taxes, do this. You add that one to wages, which is actually statutory fund. You cannot stop paying people. So that one is also non-discretionary, and then you add interest payment, which is also non-discretionary. Once you do that, your domestic resource is finished, it's gone. So any other thing that government wants to do, you must either go and borrow, or you must pray that somebody will come and give you grant. Now, to deal with that, and that was a way of dealing with the macroeconomy, the first thing to say today is to look at those rigid expenditures, what you can do about them. You can't cut wages, you can do payroll reforms, you can going forward rationalize employment and all that, but immediately you cap your earmark funds, which is the first step that has been taken. I'm confident that that would yield positives for the economy. And then as we work, and we will work, on industry, the generation of wealth, I'm confident that the economy would pick up much faster than we have seen in recent years. And that is what ultimately I think will deliver us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me come to you, Mr. Oroh. Let's go into the hypothetical space where banks aren't lending to government but are free to do business with the private sector. You see all sorts of opportunities and people with different ideas that require funding. If we're going to chart this path to growth, what areas do you see as our lowest hanging fruits that require attention?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. All protocols observed. I think our job today is to define, like you said, our path for growth. Dr. Kofi Amoah started by referring to low-hanging fruits, which is essentially our extractive industry, and agriculture. But a problem I have with low-hanging fruits is that it puts us in a trap. Really, the better fruits are up the tree. So if you tend to just focus on the low-hanging fruits, you never really get enough. So it's a paradox. And the Honorable Minister also spoke about, encouraging the private sector. And I believe really that if any country will experience growth, we must look towards the private sector. Another trap we seem to have found ourselves in is also to think that government will have to be involved in everything. Everything about budget deficit, fiscal deficit, is all because we are just waiting on government and our key cocoa, gold, and the other extractive products. We need to move from that paradigm. The ruler of Dubai, Mohammed bin Maktoum, he said the future belongs to those who dare to dream and have the courage to pursue their dreams. He wasn't talking about individuals only. He was also referring to nations. And the story of Dubai is what we know, from nothing to a great economy. Dr. Kofi referred to Malaysia. If you look at the books of Malaysia today, and you see the contributions to GDP, you probably find that, yes, agriculture, palm oil is a significant part, but they've made a lot of progress in industrial products. The same thing with Singapore. Singapore was more or less was extracted from a better Malaysia. And under great leadership, they were able to find a very good economy from the kind of innovation and development they were able to craft for themselves in Singapore. So what am I trying to say? We must look at development in Ghana from an integrative and comprehensive perspective. What are we talking about? Growth is a measure of the inflation-adjusted market value of goods and services, not necessarily agricultural goods and services. We need to look at it as a component, a full basket. And the way we talk about growth at the macro and the macro level, it's not so different from how the firms at the industry level will measure growth. It's about what the neoclassical economists refer to as the production possibility frontier. Any combination of goods around the frontier, around a curve, which slopes towards the right, any combination of goods around that curve is said to be a maximum output. To the left is an area where production is, or the output is not good enough. To the right is that area where the output is what we want to have, but it's unobtainable given the resources that we have. And our job in this summit as a country is to see how we can shift this curve to the right. Now, we're not living in isolation. We're living in a country, and like somebody said earlier, that we are at the back of this development chain, and we have countries that have gone through this and have successfully transformed their countries. What did they do right? You take the Eurozone, for example. The Eurozone is formed on 4 pillars: freedom of movement of capital, freedom of movement of people, freedom of movement of goods, and freedom of movement of services. Without following that architecture wholeheartedly, we can extract and adapt those policies in our environment to achieve a holistic growth. Now, to grow, we need capital. And capital is about foreign direct investments. What do foreign direct investors, what do they look to come to an economy? It's the right policy, a stable environment, stable foreign exchange, stable interest rate, stable dwindling inflation rates. Those are the things they look for. Now, once you are able to take care of the policy issues, the foreign direct investment will naturally flow to us. And once they come, the private sector will be enabled, and investments will grow within the economy, not only in the agri sector, but also in the industrial area, which is what we want to really move into the next level. Because really, if you take cocoa, this time last year, cocoa was doing about $3,000 per ton, thereabout. Today it's hovering around $2,000. And you are looking at 860,000 tons for our economy. That is about $860 million lost in revenue, because we are focusing on the extractive, narrow industry of agriculture. I believe we could dwell on that curve, but it's also an opportunity for us to use that curve to generate the industrial economy that we seek to. Now, for us to also achieve the industrial growth, or the growth that we're talking about, we also need to look at the human capital. Because it is the human beings, the quality, the empowerment in the human beings that generate the production that we're talking about for the economy. Now, the UN itself developed the Human Development Index. And if you look at that index, they classified nations into 40 categories: the very high, the medium, and the very low Human Development Index. By the way, the HDI measures your level of education, how much time people spend in school, and we talked about the quality of education and the relevance of the education. How nurtured is the population, and the per capita income of that population. If you look at Ghana around that index, we are falling very below, close to number 140 in the index of about 180. That is too low. And most African countries are down that chain. And that's because we have found ourselves in that. So if we must move forward, we have to find ways to invest in productive education, relevant education. The senior ministers made so much reference to that.